Hilchos Tumas Tzaraas Perek Shneim Asar, the laws of impurity imparted by Tzaraas, chapter 12. We're done with Tzaraas of the skin. Today we're moving on to the next category, Tzaraas on clothing. A lot of the principles are going to be the same. Same way when it came to Tzaraas on the skin, there's two parts to an impure lesion. First of all, the lesion itself. Then you have the Simone Tuma, the signs of impurity that show up in the lesion. Same thing with Tzaraas on clothes. You have the lesion itself, and then you have signs of impurity, which in this case are primarily the color and whether it spreads or not. And it's a very wide-ranging chapter that covers basically all the details of the basics of Tzaraas of clothes. So let's get right into it. Tzaraas begodim, says the Rambam. Tzaraas of clothing, kigris. First of all, the size of a lesion, in order to be qualifying, it needs to be the size of a gris, which is a type of bean. When it came to the skin, the Rambam defined it as 6 by 6 hairs. That's the area of a gris. Tzaraas adam, same size as Tzaraas of the skin. Aval pachas mikigris tahar. But if a lesion is less than a gris size, it's pure. No need to look any further. There are 3 signs of impurity when it comes to Tzaraas of the clothes. And they are yerakrak, a green shade, va'adamdam, a deep red shade, va'hapisyain, and spreading. All 3 are clear in the Torah that they are signs of impurity. Yerakrak, when we talk about deep red, hu hayarik shabeyerukin, it means the greenest of the green. Shehu yarik harbe, which is very green, kiknaf hatavas, like the wing or the feathers of a tavas. Tavas is typically understood to be a peacock. There's some debate about that. Some say yarik is not even green, it's more of a yellowish tinge, but we're going to go with the classic understanding. Ukehutze dekel, or like the leaves of a palm branch, very deep green. Va'adamdam, when we say deep red in the Torah, hu ha'adam shaba'adumim, it means very, very red, the reddest of the red. Shehu adam harbe kizohiris yafa, very red, like beautiful scarlet. Both of these colors actually combine. The whole lesion doesn't have to be green or red. It could be a combination of the two. When the lesion shows up as green or red, really it means deep green or deep red, but I'll just translate it as green or red. Masgirin es habeged. So the first thing you do is you put the clothing into quarantine for 7 days. If nothing happened, the color didn't change, the size didn't change, then you put it to a second week of quarantine. If it stayed in this appearance for 2 weeks straight, nothing changed, machlitin, then, unlike when it came to Tzaraas of the skin, after 2 weeks of no change you go home, here actually it means fully impure. This is, in other words, at this point, the green and the red become a siman tuma. The surfin, and you burn the clothing as you do when a clothing becomes afflicted with Tzaraas. The chenim pasa, so too if it spread. After the first week or after the second week, machlitin, v'sarfin, you declare it decidedly impure and you burn it. Ketzad, what does this mean? Let's get into the details of these 3 simone tuma. Beged shenira nega yirakrak oyadamdam. A piece of clothing has a lesion appear on it that's deep green or deep red. Masgir shivas yamim, you put it in quarantine for 7 days. Ubashvi raya, on the 7th day you inspect it, the Kohen inspects it. Impasa machlita, if it spread, that's it, it's impure. V'soyrif as kolabeged, you burn the entire clothing, entire cloth. If it didn't spread and it just stayed its color, the color didn't change at all. Or the lesion spread, but the color is now no longer as deep. Lighter than the 2 colors upon which it was declared to go into quarantine. So even though you have the pisyon, but you don't now have the yirakrak or adamdam, or it got darker, an even deeper, redder or greener, and it didn't spread. Yechabes, in all these cases, we're not here nor there. And so what do? You have to deeply clean the piece of clothing, in the place of the lesion, and you put it into a second week of quarantine to see what's going to happen now. At the end of the second week, which is actually day 13. Even though 2 weeks is 14 days, as we saw in chapter 9 when it came to Tzaraas of the skin, we count the 7th day for the end of 1 week and the beginning of the next week as well. So day 13 is the end of the second week. The Kohen checks it. If it changed to a third appearance of a color, you just put it into a wash and it's pure. But if at the end of the second week it changes, if it was first green, it became red, red, it became green. So here you tear out the area of the lesion, the seiref mashakara, and you burn that which you have torn out, because that's the affected part. V'toifer matlis b'makim shakara, and you put a patch in the place where you tore it out. Upaiter shara beged, you can put the rest out to be exempted. Umechapse kule kibul sheni, wash it out very well a second time. Umadbile, put it in the mikveh v'toyer, and it's pure. V'im amad b'mara, but if after 2 weeks it stayed as is, no changes here or there, b'mara shuzka b'mitchila, in the same appearance that it was first put into quarantine, yachlitai v'yisref eskulai, it's declared impure and the whole piece of clothing has to be burnt, no patches, that's it. Halacha beis nega shahaya yerakrak, upasa adamdam. A lesion came and it was deep green. When it spread, the spreading was red. Or it was red and it spread green. And it's considered to be a spreading. Because in the end of the day, green and red combine with each other. As long as there's a spreading of any sort, it's impure. Let's say the lesion appeared on a piece of clothing as a hollow circle. It was an outline, but there was an empty space in the middle. And the lesion then spread inwards. Like with tzaraas on the skin, it's not called a spreading. Ad sheyifse lachutz, until it spreads outwards. She'ein psias hanega lesoichai pisyon, because the spreading of a nega inside towards the inside is not considered a pisyon. Bein be'adam, bein bibgadim, ubatim, whether it's the category of tzaraas of the skin, tzaraas of the clothing, or tzaraas of homes. Halacha dalid hapisyon. When we're talking about spreading, hasamuch, if it's juxtaposed, in other words, it's literally the lesion spreading outwards. If it's talking about clothing tzaraas, even the slightest amount is considered to be a spreading. But if it's another lesion, it's a spreading because more lesion appeared, but it isn't directly next to the original lesion. Or a lesion which returns after being declared pure, kigris, has to be the regular size of a gris. What does this mean? Ketzat. Beged shehusgar v'nedad b'nega acher kigris. You have a piece of clothing that was put into quarantine over a lesion, and during the quarantine, a new lesion comes on, the size of a gris, distant from the original lesion for which it was quarantined. That's called to be a spreading, even though it didn't spread outwards, but it's a new lesion that appeared. The yisaref, and the whole thing has to be burnt. It's considered to be a spreading of the original lesion. If it was less than a gris, we don't look at it, because it's not considered a pisyon. Similarly, if you have a piece of clothing which required you to tear out the area of the lesion at the end of the second week, that was the case we had before, when it changes from red to green or green to red. Commissioner, as we just explained, the chazar by nega kigris, and now you have a clothing with no lesion. Comes back a new lesion. If it's the size of a gris, yisaref, it's burnt right away, totally impure. Also, if you have a piece of clothing which the nega spread after it was exempted. In other words, the case as the commentators explain means you had a piece of clothing, the lesion healed, it was declared pure, and then it comes back. That's also called nega hachoizer. Not only a patch case, but even a fully exempted one. If it comes back, size of a gris, yisaref, it has to be burnt. It's not called a new lesion, it's a continuation of the old lesion. When you thoroughly wash the area of a lesion after the first week, as we explained in the case, you must also wash a little bit of the area of the clothing outside of the lesion area. Remember, because it says, the Rambam skips the word v'chibsu, they have to wash eis asher boy hanoga, the clothing upon which the lesion developed, which means a little bit of the clothing also has to be washed. During the process of washing the clothing with lesions on them, ma'avirin aleyan shivas samimonin shema'avirin ala kesem. Wow, this is a blast from the past. We have to place upon them the 7 ingredients that we put on a stain to determine whether it's a blood stain from nida. As we explained way back in the Rambam's 5th book, when it comes to nida, a woman who sees a stain and doesn't know if it's blood from her own uterus or from somewhere else, you can you kind of rub it, you treat it with 7 different ingredients in a specific order, different detergents, some other things, urine that's been delayed for 40 days, spit, saliva from somebody who wakes up in the morning without tasting anything, a whole list of those 7 things, and that will determine if it's a blood stain or not. So that is also used in the procedure of cleaning nige begadim, clothing with tzaraas. By the way, these are going to come up again, these shiva samimonim, in the next set of laws. So shelve them, don't keep them too far from your mind. Let's say it was the case we mentioned before, where you have a piece of clothing which requires you to tear out the area of the lesion and put a patch. And a new lesion, size of a gris, comes back not on the place of the patch, but elsewhere on the piece of clothing. So even though that makes the clothing, it's considered nega hachayzer and it's done, but at least you can remove the patch and save the patch. Every piece of cloth in those days was very precious, so if you can save a piece, you saved it. Then you burn the rest of the clothing. But if the nega came back to the actual patch, you got to burn everything, there's no saving going on. You have a piece of clothing, it was put into quarantine and then declared pure, as the commentaries explain. And then you take a piece of that cloth and you patch it al hatoher onto a piece of pure clothing which never was impure at all. The chazar nega al habeged, and now lesion reappears on the original clothing that had a lesion. You took off a piece and put it onto a pure piece of clothing, but then now the original clothing got a new nega. Soidef esamatlis, you have to burn the piece of clothing and the patch that you attached to the pure clothing. Chazar al hamatlis, if it came back to the patch, habeged arishan hamuzgar yisarif, so the original piece of clothing also has to be burnt. The hamatlis teshamesh asabeged sheitfura bay b'simonin, the patch will consider it to be part of, it will serve the clothing which is on right now and has to be re-examined from new. If it has the proper simone tuma, im amad be'enesh ne shavua, say pasa, so for nakel, if it stays with its color for 2 weeks or it spreads, you burn everything, the patch and the piece of clothing to which it is attached. Halacha ches, beged shaba kulay, batchila yirakrak ayadamdam. A clothing that comes to the Kohen for inspection initially, fully green or red. Like we have with Tzaraas in the skin. Yeah? Person shows up, his entire body is covered in Tzaraas. Here too, the clothing is covered fully in Tzaraas. Masgire shavua achar shavua, you put it into quarantine again for 2 weeks. Im amad b'shnei shavuos, if it stays for 2 weeks in the same color, you start if it's burnt. Aval beged shehiz gira. But once you have clothing that was put into quarantine, and during quarantine, upasa nega bekulei, v'nasa yirakrak v'adamdam, then it spreads to the entirety of the clothing, and it fully becomes green or red, or you exempted it. And then it comes back fully green or red, then it's actually pure. Kind of like tzaraas on the skin. Once in a state of impurity or questionability, when it spreads to the entirety of the body, it becomes pure. Kanas upasa yisarif. If the clothing appeared fully green or red, so you put it into quarantine, then it retreated a little bit, and then that's after 1 week, and then after 2 weeks it spread, yisarif, that's called a spreading, and has to be burnt, even though it's returning to the original way that it was before, doesn't make a difference. If it spreads between 1 week and the next, it's impure. Halacha tes. Beged shahayu moichin yoitzen al panav min ha'arik. A piece of clothing that's new, and therefore has a little bit, some strands sticking out on its surface from the weave. This was very common. Today, you buy clothes, they're fully professional, you don't have these issues. But when you did, hand weaving, so a new piece of clothing had these little balls of thread that would kind of accumulate on the face of the weave. Once you used clothing for a while, those balls would kind of recede and it would just be a flat surface. But in the beginning, there were these little moichin that would come out. It could go in sagais shal tzemer, like a very thick cloak made out of wool. It's very common to have these little balls come out. V'nira b'nega. If a lesion appears on those protruding balls of yarn or of thread, eine mitame, it doesn't make the clothing impure until the lesion appears both on the balls and on the weave itself. In other words, the clothing itself has to get the tzaraas. Now the Rambam explains the novelty of this halacha. That which the Torah says when it comes to the clothing, that the lesions could appear either on karachtoi or gabachtoi, one might be inclined to interpret these two terms as two parts of clothing. The weave itself and the balls protruding from the weave. Says the Rambam, no. Karachtoi elu hashchakim, gabachtoi elu hachadashim. Karachtoi means old clothing, gabachtoi means new clothing. Both types of clothing, both new and old, are subject to tzaraas laws, but both in the same way, as long as the lesion appears on the surface of the weave, not on the balls that are protruding. Halacha yod habegodim hatzvuyin enan metamin b'negoyim. Dyed clothing cannot become impure with tzaraas. Bein shal yutzvuyin b'dei adam, bein b'dei shamayim, whether they are originally white and were dyed, or they were naturally colored. Ad sheyu levanim, they have to be white. Very interesting, you don't think about this a lot, but tzaraas on clothes has to be white clothes. Beged shashisyo tzavua ve'erbei lavan. What if the warp threads going one way, the length way, are dyed, and the other way threads, the woof, are white? Erbei tzavua ve'shisyo lavan. The woof is colored and the warp is white. It all goes after what's apparent. Whatever you see white, it has the laws of tzaraas. If not, not. If you have an area of cloth that's less than 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths from the weave, it does not become tameh through Tzaraas, it has to be at least 3 by 3 finger breadths. Halacha Yud Aleph. Beged she'arag boi paches mishalish etzbois al shalish. You have a piece of clothing which you wove less than 3 by 3. In other words, you're in the middle of weaving a new piece of clothing, but you only had a chance to weave a part that's less than the amount that's subject to the laws of Tzaraas. And now a nega appears. Then you complete it to the proper size. Tahar, it's pure, even though the lesion is still there, because when it appeared, it wasn't the required amount. Halacha Yud Beis ha'toifer matliya she'ein b'chol achas v'achas mihen shalish al shalish. You take a bunch of little patches, each one too small to become afflicted with Tzaraas. V'asam mihen beged, and you make them into one piece of clothing. Harezeh mitami bin agayim, it could contract Tzaraas lesions. Sha'atafur ka'aruk, because sewed up pieces of cloth are like woven. The kulay beged echadu, it's all one piece of clothing. Halacha Yud Gimel beged shu matliyas. The same case, a piece of clothing which is made of a bunch of different patches, mehen svui, no mehen levanim, but some are dyed, colored, and some are white. If a lesion appears on the white, we make it subject to the laws of Tzaraas, we put it into quarantine. If it stays for 2 weeks, it becomes totally impure and you burn the whole thing, but including the dyed parts, because the Tzaraas appeared on the white, which is the part that could become Tzaraas. Same thing if it spread. It was on one part of the white, and then it spread to another part of the white. It's called spreading. Even though between them there's area that's colored, doesn't make a difference. As long as all the Tzaraas appeared on the white, it's impure. If it was all colored, but there's one strand, or one area, one stripe that's white, even if it's only the size of a gris, which is the whole minimum size of a lesion, the nida by nega and a nega appears on it, yasgir, you got to put it all into quarantine. Even though it can't spread anywhere, but if it stays the same color for 2 weeks without adding or becoming darker, shnei shavuos for 2 weeks, you start if it's going to be burnt. So because that white part could become ultimately impure, at this point you must put it into quarantine.